Well, now it's time during the semester to start our second kind of global environmental change, and that is cumulative change. And if you remember, that's when an activity is repeated so frequently in such large areas around the world that if we add it all up, it accumulates into a truly global scale problem. And the two problems we're going to talk about include deforestation and desertification. Now, both of these terms are examples of something called land transformation. Now, when we talk about deforestation in particular, we're talking about a type of land transformation in which there are two main components. And you know these terms. We talked about them at the beginning of the semester. But let's have a review. So if you recall, when we talked about proximate causes of environmental change, we could talk about industrial ecology, which really had to do with factory production. And the second was activities that created land use or land cover change. So with both deforestation and desertification, these are both cumulative changes that result from the second category of proximate change in land use and land cover. So, as a quick review, if you remember, land use refers to the human use of the land in terms of how humans are actually using that area for their own purposes. So it might include settlement, it might include cultivation, it might include pasture land, it could include recreation. So as you can see, the term land use refers to the human use of the land. Now, when we're talking about change in land use, we could talk about either a change from one use to another use, or we can talk about the intensification of an existing land use. So, for example, if we want to talk about a total shift in land use, we could talk about the change from a residential land use at the edge of a city to an industrial land use. Or we could refer to the intensification of existing ones. For example, agriculture. We may see a shift from use for crops to using the same land for grazing. So land use refers to the human use. And of course, what we're looking at is changes in human use for land. Now, usually this is the material that the social sciences study. So anthropology, which is about humans, geography, planners, they're interested in how humans use the land for their own purposes and how it meets their needs. Now, the other type of land transformation has to do with land cover. And if you remember, land cover refers to the physical state of the land, what is covering the land. And it might include, for example, the quantity and type of surface vegetation. It could include the percentage of water, wetlands. It could include earth descriptions of earth materials. These are all natural things that cover the land in certain proportions. And of course, it can change through time. Now, when we're talking about land cover, it's usually studied by people in the natural sciences. So if you're talking about hydrology or geology, botany, agricultural research, these are all really looking at land cover. What is there? How does it change? Why does it change? In terms of the natural science component. And of course, in geography, we put the two together, because we recognize that humans change their use of the land, which results in changes in land cover. So we're going to connect the two ideas. So we step back and think about our proximate forces of change. Land use and land cover are both connected because they form one of the two categories of proximate forces of change. So, from this perspective, through proximate forces, human goals, which could be the result of human driving forces, those human goals of land use can create change in land cover. So moving from grassland cover to cropland. So land use and land cover are connected. So it might be biomass burning to clear land for agriculture. It could be, when we talk about the rainforest, slash and burn agriculture. In order to clear the land to attempt to grow their own food, many peasants, peasants means someone who doesn't have land, is landless. There's countries like Brazil which tell people if they go and clear the land, they can actually grow their own food and it becomes theirs. So in those instances, biomass burning, literally burning the forest to the ground to clear land for agriculture, is one example of a change in land cover that's driven by a need to change land use. It might be plowing under shrubs for livestock, which is the same kind of example. So let's talk about this in the context of deforestation, and then we'll do it in the context of desertification. So what I've done is put a series of between 10 and 20 minute presentations together, which cover different aspects of, to begin with, deforestation. So this will serve as our introduction. And following this presentation, I will make another presentation on proximate, non-proximate forces, direct, indirect impacts, responses, and so on. So let's talk a little bit about deforestation. We'll give you some definitions and put it into a context so we can start to talk about proximate and non-proximate forces and how they vary globally. So the concept of deforestation is basically the total conversion of forest, and this refers to any type of forest, if it's rainforest or coniferous forest or deciduous forest. The total conversion of forest to other uses, human uses, in which no forest remains. So what we're talking about here is total clearance of the land. So different terms you hear with regards to this. Basically, it's the removal or clear felling, which refers to cutting down all the trees, of not just the forest in terms of the trees that might be used for lumber or fuel wood, but also the undergrowth, the low shrubs and grasses. Deforestation typically results in the entire land surface being cleared through one process or another. So a quote that demonstrates this effectively is the complete destruction of forest cover through clearing. So not a tree remains and the land is given over to non-forest purposes. Now, as we talk about this, of course, we'll talk about timber in the context of North America. And I want you to think a little bit about when they clear fell a large area of land. Quite often that is replanted, and there are places where it's required. But in replanting, they don't replant the same species that were removed. When you think about clear felling, you're removing a huge diversity of everything from coniferous trees, deciduous trees, grasses, shrubs. Everything is gone. When lumber companies are required to reforest it, they usually plant the same species of trees. So what you would end up with essentially is almost like a tree farm. So you do not get the original forest reestablishing in the long term. So to give you a context of deforestation globally, and then we'll talk about specific locations as examples, I think this is an interesting graph to look at because it reflects the impact of colonization on how the great colonizers of Western Europe basically took advantage of its colonies for wood, extraction of wood to send it back to Europe in kind of the early 1700s. And then gradually we see a shift to a focus on wood extraction and deforestation from tropical forests. So if we start pre-1790, you can see that we're looking at massive amounts of deforestation. Here they estimate 400 million hectares. A hectare is about 2.4 acres. So pre-1700, huge amounts of deforestation were happening in temperate forests. So the way to visualize this is the United States and Canada. Is when Britain, France, the Spanish, even the Dutch were here for a while. Of course, one thing they took advantage of was the huge amounts of wood that were available in the colonies, and massive deforestation happened within a really short period of time. So from pre-1700 down to 1850, for example, down to 1919, as we go through the dark green column, which is temperate forest, which was referring to basically mid-latitude forests, huge amounts are removed, largely shipped to Europe before 1850 or so, and then after that, of course, land was cleared for agriculture. As land was settled further west in the United States, tens of thousands of square acres of, or I should say millions of square acres, were cut to allow for agriculture and to use wood, of course, for construction. But through time, you can see in a relative context, by the early beginning of the 2000s, in terms of scale of millions, our deforestation rates have really dropped off. And a large part of that is because we've cut it down already. And we'll look at some numbers and maps down the line. Now, when you look at the tropical forests, a lot of those tropical areas were the last to be colonized. And so you don't start to see the destruction of rainforests really until the period from 1700 to 1850. And then a little bit of a lull once more developed countries realize, like the United States and Canada, which exist by then, they start to realize that they are exploiting and overusing their own forest resources. So instead, they start to look to tropical forests, which are not necessarily fully colonized or fully exploited, and they look to meet lumber needs there. But this also reflects an increasing population in tropical forest regions where overpopulation is forcing people into forest regions. They're encouraged to cut down, burn down the forests in order to establish small farms where they can try to produce food for themselves. But that too, of course, is decreasing through time. Part of it, global awareness that it's a massive problem, change in land ownership and use patterns, and we'll talk a little bit about this. But I think the geography here is fascinating in terms of, think of the Canada and the United States really over-harvesting for 200 years. And then, of course, the increase in tropical deforestation following that. Now, here's another interesting pattern, and this is more recent. This is from 1950 on the left, and you can see up to 2009. We have 3 different colors representing, of course, geographies. The Amazon region is dark green, and you can see through time, starting in the 1950s, when Western European and the United States get more involved in not just exploiting the region of the Amazon for mining. You see increased number of people in Brazil who become landless because of changes in technology. They're no longer needed as labor on the farms. And the government encourages them to go out into different regions of largely Western Brazil to claim land for themselves, which results in cutting down rainforest, burning the rainforest. But through time, international markets get interested. They are interested in the minerals that are there. So massive regions are deforested for large open pit mining, everything from copper, gold mining. But you can see through time that the activities in the Amazon have just increased by leaps and bounds up through the early 2000s, and only recently, because of a number of reasons, has started to decline. And for the Amazon, we could talk about everything from inequitable distribution of wealth, we could talk about corruption, we could talk about ideology of the government. And as different political parties get elected, of course, they have very different ideas about what should happen in the rainforest. Now, if we look to Southeast Asia, which is the kind of orange, rusty color, you can see that the exploitation of deforest, it was much more slow in the area of Southeast Asia. Now, this might include Indonesia, Malaysia, Thailand, Cambodia. Didn't rise at nearly as quick a rate, but through time, that deforestation rate has jumped amazingly high. And a lot of this is because in these kinds of locations, you get some of the rare woods, teak and mahogany. And through time, there's a greater demand in more developed countries for it. It gets harder and harder for the government to control what's going on. So in this part of the world, Southeast Asia, corruption, illegal logging, international demand for some of the rare woods have really driven up the deforestation rates in those places. Now that leaves us with the Congo Basin in the interior of Africa, and you can see very, very slow increase in deforestation, and largely that has to do with how the interior of Africa was colonized. A number of those countries in the interior, like the Congo, Democratic Republic of Congo, they didn't become independent until maybe the 1950s and 60s. So it hasn't been until more recently that these countries have kind of pulled it together to take advantage of their resources, in this case, trees. But also, those countries, in terms of their geography, being in the interior of the continent, make it very difficult to ship wood globally. And so it's really not until we start to see more participation in the global economy that we start to see, rail infrastructures that allow countries in the interior to actually develop their wood resources for export and for their own use. Now, a couple last slides to give you a context. From 2000 to 2005, if we look at the changing geography, this graph represents is the deforestation rates. And in a 5-year period, you can see that Nigeria and Vietnam have really surpassed 50% deforestation rates in a very short period of time. And that reflects international interests, the global demand for wood, and the fact that these countries really need some income. Cambodia, Southeast Asia, of course, is not far behind at 30%. Sri Lanka, which is the island country just to the south east of India, and Malawi in Africa, those both have considerable rates of deforestation. Now, if we look at hectares per year in terms of the total volume, the previous slide was the rate, and of course that would be proportionate to the total amount that each country had. If we look at the number of hectares per year lost in that same 5-year period, Brazil clearly stands out as number one for a whole variety of different reasons. Indonesia is the next highest, but does fall quite significantly behind. But have a look, the Russian Federation, Mexico, Papua New Guinea, Peru, here's the United States. And of course, the United States in terms of land mass is the 4th largest country in the world. So we are doing deforestation at a much slower rate, but that's largely because we've either already cleared most of our forests, or we're meeting a lot of our needs by importing wood from less developed countries. We're saving our own. Followed by Bolivia in South America, and then Sudan and Nigeria in Africa. Now, why are we concerned? This is just a very general statement, and we're going to look at impacts, direct and indirect, in another presentation. But you should be familiar with a lot of this by now. Losing forests means a loss of biodiversity. And just cutting down trees and removing shrubs, of course, we see extinction of birds and animals and insects and reptiles and amphibians because of that, the result. We're removing some of the lungs of the planet when we talk about exchange of carbon. As you know, the main reservoir is carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. One of the major things that humans do that interferes with the cycling of carbon, of course, is to remove vegetation. So such massive deforestation means less carbon is being removed from the atmosphere. And if a lot of that wood is burned, a lot of the carbon that would be stored for maybe a few centuries in decaying wood is released rapidly into the atmosphere. One of the things that happens when we remove all the vegetation during the process of deforestation is we leave behind barren land, uncovered land. So what it means through wind and, of course, water movement, increase in erosion rates means any soil that had potential for development can be washed away and not only lose its potential for any agriculture, but flowing into rivers, sediment can be very significant to decrease in the productivity in river systems because it literally clouds the water so that fish and other organisms can't find food. And as we'll talk about in the rainforest, rainforests have a lot of rain because of the trees. And so what's happening is when we're reducing the percentage of rainforest in large areas of the tropical regions, we're actually seeing a change in the rainfall pattern, which ultimately has a huge impact on not just the rest of the ecosystem, but on human populations as well.